Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome. Thanks so much for joining us today for our second webinar of the week, all part of our second phase of pre-proposal stakeholder outreach on the New York Cap and Invest program, or NYCI. Some of you joined us earlier this week on Tuesday, where we provided an overview of the NYCI program and its intended role in the state's overall portfolio of policies to reduce emissions and meet the requirements of the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, or Climate Act. For today's webinar, we're going to be focusing on the pre-proposal outline document that we released on December 20th of last year. That document is available on the capandinvest.ny.gov website. The pre-proposal outline presents some initial direction or current leanings on proposed program design elements, including in response to questions that we raised in our first phase of these webinars last year. Tomorrow, Friday, January 26th, from 11 a.m. to 2 p.m., we will be holding our third webinar of the week, which will focus on analysis conducted regarding the NYCI program's projected benefits and costs. These webinars are all part of the extensive outreach that DEC and NYSERDA are undertaking on the development of the Cap and Invest program. The NYCI program will be an important part of the future of our state, and all of your input is fundamental to developing a successful program. Before we dive into the content, I'm going to pass it over to Anna from Cadmus to describe the procedure for today's webinar. Anna?
Yes, thank you, John. Just a few reminders that as an attendee, you will not be able to unmute or turn on your video. Attendees will, however, be able to submit questions via the Q&A feature. Select clarifying questions will be answered by panelists. If you are having tech issues and would like help, you can also submit a request via the Q&A feature. We will do our best to assist you. If you can't hear the presentation, we can configure your audio settings by clicking the arrow in the audio box. This will allow you to change the speaker settings. If you're having connectivity issues, you can also press Switch Audio to Phone, and this will allow you to listen to audio of the webinar through your phone. Today's webinar will also offer live captioning and translation services. You can turn on closed captioning for the presentation at the bottom of the screen. You can also change the language of the captions by pressing the Translation to setting. Finally, this webinar is being recorded. The webinar recording will be posted on the New York State website at capandinvest.ny.gov. Next slide, please.
Thanks very much, Anna. And really thanks to all of you for joining us again for another webinar in our Cap and Invest series. I don't think I introduced myself, by the way. I'm John Binder. I'm the Deputy Commissioner for Climate Change, Air Resources, and Energy here at the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation. And together with our colleagues at NYSERDA, we welcome your continued input as we continue the design of this state's Cap and Invest program to help us meet the requirements of the Climate Act. As we explained on Tuesday's overview webinar, together with other complementary policies, NYCI is going to accelerate our progress and ensure the state is on a trajectory to meet the statewide emission limits that are set in the Climate Act. So this first slide here will look familiar to those of you who joined us on Tuesday. And developing a Cap and Invest program like this really is a complex undertaking, and we have intentionally designed the process to seek feedback from you all in multiple stages. So we completed a series of initial webinars and roundtables, including with climate justice and labor groups last year. That was all part of our first phase of pre-proposal outreach. We got a lot of input during that first phase, and we incorporated that input into that pre-proposal outline document that we released last month. That's the focus of today's webinar. So we're now in the second phase of pre-proposal stakeholder outreach, but critically, and this is a point that we will keep underscoring, we are still in the pre-proposal stage. And that's an important concept because providing early information to us is really helpful to us as we design the program. We're wanting to provide our current thinking and leanings as we build the structure of the regulations. This means that we have not yet made final decisions on any of these program elements that we're talking about today because we are continuing to seek your input. We encourage you to continue to provide feedback, and that can be done directly on the website, as we'll get to in a moment. After incorporating input that we received during the second phase of outreach, DEC and NYSERDA will then move to the formal regulatory proposal stage later this year. That will also include a formal public comment period. And finally, I want to add here that NYSERDA and DEC are also going to be welcoming stakeholder input on the investment side of the program. On tomorrow's analysis webinar, you will see how the investment portion of the program, meaning the investment of the proceeds that come from NYCI allowance auctions, you'll see how these are a critical part of accelerating the emission reduction and clean energy transitions that we're trying to achieve here. They're also a critical part of ensuring affordability. So we look forward to starting engagement on this portion of the program later this year. Moving on to the next slide, which also might look familiar to some of you who've been following this process, but as a reminder, there are a variety of ways that you can learn more and stay involved in our ongoing NYCI program development process. You can receive email alerts on upcoming events by signing up at the Climate Act mailing list. The slide decks and recordings of today's webinar will be posted on the Cap and Invest website at capandinvest.ny.gov. That also includes materials from previous webinars, including from earlier this week and last year, and key documents and materials, including the pre-proposal outline that we're going to be walking through today, all are also available on that website. You can also submit comments directly via the website by clicking the Submit Comment buttons. And later on at the end of the webinar, Joe Berman from NYSERDA will provide screenshots and a little bit more detail about how to do that. If you do have questions about how to comment, please enter them into the Q&A and we'll address them. So moving on to the next slide. Our plan for today is really to walk through the proposed and anticipated elements of the NYCI program as it's described in the pre-proposal outline document. Several key team members and technical experts from both DEC and NYSERDA are here today, and they will provide an overview of the technical details of our anticipated program design. There are two main parts to the pre-proposal. The first is the mandatory greenhouse gas reporting program, which will provide a comprehensive program established by DEC that will serve as the foundation of the Cap and Invest program. And then the second main part is the Cap and Invest program itself, which will be comprised of two different regulations. That will include a Cap and Invest regulation established by DEC and a companion auction rule to be established by NYSERDA. The pre-proposal outline document provides details on each of these two main components of the NYCI program, and we'll be going through them in detail and outlining them in turn throughout the course of today's webinar. Moving on to the next slide, just to provide a little bit more context for the details that you're going to be hearing about from the DEC and NYSERDA team. The mandatory greenhouse gas reporting program is going to be established in a new DEC regulation, which will be Part 253 of DEC's regulations. And this regulation will include details regarding the types of emission sources that must report information to DEC, along with relevant thresholds for reporting and the type of information that will be required to be reported to us and to be verified. The second regulation will be the Cap and Invest regulation, which will be Part 252 of DEC's regulations. This regulation will include details like how to set the greenhouse gas emissions cap, the downward trajectory of that greenhouse gas emissions cap, how various adjustments are made to account for non-obligated emissions, what types of entities are required to comply with the program. We refer to those as obligated entities. How these obligated entities will need to comply with the program, potential regulatory mechanisms to address disadvantaged communities, and a lot more details as well. And then finally, the third regulation that is part of this overall NYCI program will be the auction rule, which will be, again, a regulation to be established by NYSERDA. That rule will include details like logistics for how to participate in allowance auctions, how allowance auctions will be conducted, along with rules to protect market integrity. So throughout the course of today's presentation, you'll hear from DEC and NYSERDA experts that will be walking us through each of these anticipated program details. So on to the next slide, and I think it's another one that will be familiar to many of you. Before we get into those pre-proposal details, we do want to take a moment to reiterate the principles that are continuing to serve as our guide as we develop this NYCI program. And this comes from Governor Hochul's State of the State last January, about a year ago, where, consistent with the recommendations of the Climate Action Council's scoping plan, which was issued at the end of 2022, the governor laid out for us several key principles for DEC and NYSERDA as we develop all of these program details. And first among these principles is affordability. And that's why a portion of allowance proceeds will go directly back to New Yorkers to help address energy affordability. The state budget that was enacted last year advanced these priorities further by creating the financial foundation required to support the program. It is important to keep in mind that the Climate Act requires that at least 35%, with a goal of 40% or more, of clean energy and energy efficiency investments benefit disadvantaged communities. So that's going to be another key feature and principle of the NYCI program design, to make sure that we are addressing climate justice issues. In addition to affordability and climate justice, we are also being guided by principles including climate leadership, which is really getting at making sure we're designing the program to facilitate the possibility of linking with other programs in other jurisdictions that are similar to this one that we're developing here. We also want to make sure we're creating jobs and preserving economic competitiveness, and that we're funding a sustainable future, which is again through the investment side of this program. So the pre-proposal outline that was released last month, that's available on the website, and that we're talking about today, really aims to align with all 5 of these important principles. So moving on to the next slide. Before I do turn it over to our technical experts to walk us through those details, I want to talk just for a moment about stakeholder comments, because again, this is a very important part of the program development process. As mentioned last year, during the first phase of our pre-proposal stakeholder outreach, we solicited initial stakeholder comments in response to a series of technical questions that we posed back in our June of 2023 webinar series. In response to that, we received more than 3,400 comments in response, which really is a very welcome level of engagement from the public, particularly for regulatory program design and relatively early in the process. We did carefully consider each of these comments and incorporate that input into the design of the pre-proposal outline that we released last month and that we're focusing on for today's webinar. We continue to invite and encourage additional comments from all of you as part of this second phase of pre-proposal stakeholder outreach. We do welcome input at any time, but comments at this point would be most helpful by March 1st. We encourage you to submit comments in response to the pre-proposal outline document by that date, and that can be submitted again directly at capininvest.ny.gov. So with that background, onto the next slide here, I would like to turn it over to Mike Sheehan, who is the Director of the Bureau of Air Quality Planning within DEC's Division of Air Resources. And Mike's going to start by discussing the mandatory greenhouse gas reporting program. Mike?
Thanks, John. The mandatory greenhouse gas reporting program is a standalone regulation requiring reporting of emissions and data from emission sources throughout New York. During this presentation, the regulation may be referred to as either the mandatory reporting program or perhaps Part 253. Next slide, please. Greenhouse gas emission sources that must comply with the mandatory reporting program are not automatically obligated sources under the Cap and Invest rule. Emissions reported by one reporting entity may be covered by allowances surrendered by another obligated entity that also reports those emissions per the requirements of the Cap and Invest rule. Many reporting entities will have to describe their transfers of fuel between owners so that obligations under the Cap and Invest rule are accurate. The Cap and Invest rule would clearly identify which reporting sources are required to acquire and turn in allowances under that program. This overlap in reporting is intended to provide a robust data set, increase accuracy for determining obligated emissions, and to assist in improving the annual statewide greenhouse gas report. Next slide, please. As noted in this slide, New York State collects a variety of greenhouse gas emissions information from a number of sources, including to produce that annual greenhouse gas emissions report I just mentioned, or what we also refer to as our inventory under the Climate Act. Similarly, some sources of emissions are already required to report greenhouse gas emissions information to the department. But we do not yet have a comprehensive mandatory greenhouse gas reporting program in place in the state. In a lot of ways, as John alluded to earlier, a comprehensive mandatory reporting program of this nature is foundational to the operation of NYCI, since the reported information will be utilized for a variety of purposes, including to assess obligated entity applicability and determine compliance under the cap and invest regs. Recognizing that there are some existing reporting requirements at the state and federal levels, we anticipate utilizing and leveraging those existing reporting requirements and platforms, along with the data reported to those platforms, to meet the mandatory reporting requirements when applicable. We anticipate developing a robust reporting platform for this regulation where existing data can be uploaded, new data can be reported, and all data can be processed and stored. Reporting entities will have to register with the mandatory greenhouse gas reporting program platform and provide the necessary information to support data transfers from those available existing systems. Reporting entities would also have to certify the emissions calculated through the reporting platform. Not all data from existing reporting programs may be available to the department. For example, data from fuel suppliers cannot currently be extracted from existing reporting platforms and transferred to the department. Those reporting entities would be required to report emissions and data to the NYCI reporting platform as a separate effort from existing reporting. Reporting sources may identify data as confidential business data during their reporting process. For this next slide, I'll note that existing reporting regulations from EPA, California, and other jurisdictions have continued to be evaluated as we move forward with the development of this program. Many elements of their reporting regulation are in good alignment with New York's program requirements for many emission sources. However, several emission source reporting requirements will have to be modified when writing New York's regulations. Additionally, to make these NYCI regulations economy-wide, emission sources that are not required to report to the EPA or other jurisdictions would be included in NYCI's reporting program. No matter which type of change in the text may be required, the reporting regulation needs to conform to New York State requirements and to capture New York State emission sources. To be clear, the changes identified here are in the pre-proposal outline not impact EPA or other jurisdictional text. They just reflect the anticipated differences between a New York regulation proposal and other reporting regulations. The concept of minor or major modifications, as you'll see in the coming slide, does not have a regulatory meaning and is only used in this presentation and within the pre-proposal outline to organize information. There are no bright lines separating each type of change, but rather reflect an estimate of anticipated differences between existing reporting programs and the necessary structure for the reporting program under NYCI. I will go into more detail on the next slide. This table lays out types of emission sources and the relative amount of change in reporting requirements anticipated between similar programs, such as the EPA Greenhouse Gas Reporting Program and the forthcoming New York Mandatory Reporting Program. The comparable EPA emission sources can be viewed under the federal regulation at 40 CFR Part 98 and the lettered subparts identified here. The reporting requirements for New York emission sources under the minor change column are likely to closely align with the requirements under New York's Climate Act. These Climate Act provisions, excuse me for 1 second, for emission sources that might be associated with leakage. I'm going to need a power source. Fuel suppliers or other owners of fuel destined for sale to end users in New York would be required to report the mandatory and required to report. The reporting entity would be different from EPA regulations, which focus on refiners and international importers. New York does not have refineries and international imported fuel. International imported fuel may not be destined for sale to end users in New York. Additionally, all large users of fossil fuels and fuel suppliers in particular would report emissions associated with the upstream, out-of-state production and transmission of those fossil fuels. The reporting requirements for these emission sources in New York shown under the major change column are anticipated to be different from the US EPA reporting requirements, and that they are going to be applicable to entities within New York rather than regional systems or international suppliers. The data and emissions calculations are anticipated, anticipated to be similar to the US EPA reporting program, except where change may be necessary to align with the Climate Act. Domestic wastewater treatment would be a new emission source category, but our goal is to closely align the reporting here with emissions reporting required elsewhere. Carbonates and soda ash use are anticipated to only be reported by industrial stationary sources and not as standalone categories. Glass manufacturing and EPA's newly proposed ceramic source category are also being evaluated and may be updated to align with New York's program goals. The reporting requirements for emission sources in the third column would be new under this program. These emission sources have not had to report greenhouse gas emissions before, as they are not covered by EPA's reporting program. While EPA language was developed for some of these sources, the ones with letters in parentheses, these subparts, were not implemented. DEC anticipates taking elements from the developed language and fitting it to meet New York's reporting needs. The majority of these emission sources report detailed information for other regulatory reporting programs, even if they do not currently report greenhouse gas emissions directly. For example, greenhouse gas emissions for manure management would require reporting on manure management systems. The data required for greenhouse gas emissions from these management systems is broadly consistent with data already reported for water quality purposes. Ethanol production reporting from these stationary sources where ethanol is produced includes combustion emissions and emissions from waste management. Coal supplied for combustion in New York would be reported by the owner of the fuel as it enters the state. Electricity importers are required to report emissions in other jurisdictions that have economy-wide cap and invest programs. Under New York regulations, it is anticipated electricity importers
I'm going to work, oops.
All right, apologies. Can everybody hear me again?
Yes, we can hear you, Mike.
All right. Did anybody pick off where I lost power?
We didn't quite get there, so if you could
All
just
right,
pick back up where you
thanks.
were, that would be great. Thank you.
We needed a first anyway. Suppliers of fertilizer would report sales into New York so that the utilization of nitrogen-based fertilizers is better characterized in the inventory, and the appropriate allowances are retired for these emissions from agricultural soil management. Harvest wood products would be reported by lumber mills in New York. This information would be similar to information currently collected by survey, but would now be required by regulations, so New York can accurately track these stored emissions. Reporting requirements for biological treatment of solid waste, typically anaerobic digesters, would also be required for those facilities which do not align with other waste management sectors. Waste transporters would be required to identify waste exported from New York, the organic content of the waste in the facility the waste is exported to. Next slide, please. The mandatory reporting requirements would apply to emission sources as will be defined in the regulation. This is the first step in assessing applicability under the program. The second part is comparing the emission sources activity to the established threshold, noting that these thresholds could be based on either emissions or other operational data. Emission sources owned or operated in New York, which meet an emission or operation threshold, would be required to report under this program. Together, applicability and reporting thresholds set the requirements for determining which emission sources will be reporting sources or reporting entities. Next slide. By presenting the three types of reporting threshold categories that are under consideration in this manner, we are asking for feedback on whether we are providing the clarity needed for emission sources to determine if they may be potential reporting sources. As listed, type A sources would need to report if they meet the definition for that category. Type B sources need to exceed a threshold, and type C sources may meet a definition and have a certain operational characteristic or characteristics that would subject them to the reporting rule. Would crafting the regulation with thresholds in a manner similar to how these categories are described here be sufficiently clear to potential reporting entities? Or should the thresholds be crafted around annual emissions alone, similar to identified in category B? I'll go into a little more detail on the next slide. This table shows the same information as the previous slide. We want to be clear that no final decisions have been reached in determining which threshold would apply to which source type, or if multiple threshold categories make a better program. This table is intended to stimulate feedback on what emission sources could best be served by having one of these reporting categories applied to them. Sources that exist in New York but may have variable annual emissions, such as fuel suppliers, electricity importers, or RGGI sources, might always need to report regardless of their annual emissions. Sources that are facilities and have robust permitting requirements may best be served by having an annual greenhouse gas emission threshold. Lastly, sources which may not typically calculate their greenhouse gas emissions but already report or track operational or activity data might best be served by having the reporting threshold be described in terms of their existing data reporting requirements. Next slide, please. These next three slides are offered to highlight what data could be collected once an emission source is determined to be a reporting entity, subject to the requirements of the rule. We anticipate that fuel suppliers would report their own fuel destined for final sale in New York, and emission factors would be applied to the utilization of that fuel to determine emissions. Fuel suppliers would also report fuel that was destined for final sale in New York that is subsequently exported for sale in another jurisdiction. Fuel suppliers must also report what type of entity received their fuel, including other fuel suppliers, stationary greenhouse gas emission sources, or retail filling station. Combustion greenhouse gas emission sources are anticipated to report their emissions from continuous emission monitors or from the utilization of fuels by applying promulgated emission factors to fuel volumes. Additionally, these sources would report emissions leaked or vented from on-site fuel utilization equipment. On to the next slide, please. I would note that the infrastructure used to transport fuels, such as pipelines, compressor stations, and other stationary source components, would report any on-site fuel utilization along with an inventory of emitting components. The emissions reported would be the emissions from fuel utilization and applying promulgated emission factors for the inventoried components. Additionally, planned and unplanned vented emissions would be reported. Retail filling stations would not be required to report emissions. Fuel sold through a retail filling station would be reported by the fuel supplier. Suppliers of industrial greenhouse gases would report volume sold into New York, as would producers of equipment charged with greenhouse gases. Emissions from processes at industrial facilities are anticipated to be reported based on feedstock inputs and process descriptions, or emissions would be based on factual facility level inventory of industrial greenhouse gases utilized, recovered, or lost. Additionally, facilities looking to apply as emissions intensive and trade exposed would be required to provide data on production and product outputs. I'll wrap up our data collection leanings on the next slide. Emissions from waste management would be calculated based on the organic content of waste and the waste management practice. Promulgated emission factors and formulas would be established for each organic waste and management practice. Larger facilities may have emissions monitoring data, which could inform emissions reporting. Electricity importers would be able to report emissions based on the generating source of the electricity or a default emission rate for unspecified power. Next slide. On this slide, I will discuss verification. Confirming the precision and accuracy of reported emissions is important towards attaining the required reductions in greenhouse gas emissions, along with ensuring that obligated entities turn in the correct number of allowances to cover their emissions. Third-party verification of reported emission from emission sources with annual emissions larger than 25,000 metric tons and/or all emission sources that have an allowance compliance obligation under the Cap and Invest program is anticipated. It is anticipated that third-party verifiers would be accredited by the DEC based on an application process that may consider accreditation under other programs. This ends our discussion on reporting, and I'll continue by kicking off our discussion on the next slide on the Cap and Invest program. Here I'm going to jump into a discussion on all of the elements of the planned Cap and Invest regulation. Next slide. Okay. Well, the NYCI program consists of 3 regulations and supporting actions, the key compliance requirements, with the exception of emissions reporting under the mandatory reporting program just described above for the Cap and Invest program, will be contained primarily in the 2 regulations John mentioned earlier, and will be discussed in the next portions of this presentation. DEC's cap and invest regulation requirements established under forthcoming Part 252 will include the establishment of annual enforceable greenhouse gas emissions, which decline over time consistent with the 2030 and 2050 statewide greenhouse gas emissions limits, the identification of which greenhouse gas emission sources are obligated entities and what emissions are applicable to regulatory requirements and compliance obligations, a mechanism to address emissions from non-obligated entities, and provisions to address market integrity and stability. NYSERDA's auction rule will include provisions that describe the operation of NYCI allowance auctions and mechanisms to protect the overall integrity of the allowance market. DEC's cap and invest regulation and NYSERDA's auction regulation will work in complementary fashion to collectively establish the overall program. This is similar to how New York's participation in the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative or the RGGI multi-state cap and invest program for the power sector is effectuated through two companion regulation, with the underlying program established by DEC regulation and allowance auctions established by NYSERDA's regulations. Next slide, please. In this next section, we'll be discussing what is being considered for use in establishing the emission caps and allowance budget under the cap and invest program. Next slide. In particular, while we know the caps for 2030 and 2050, based on the statewide emission limits set in the Climate Act, we are looking for your feedback on how the cap should be set for the first year of the program. Our goal is to have the cap be set at the approximate emissions amount for the first year of the program. But because we will be setting that initial cap at the outset of the program, the regulation will have to include the number for the initial emissions caps before those emissions would be reported under the new mandatory reporting program. And we would appreciate receiving your feedback on these two options under consideration. A historical method would be characterized by using reported data to set a cap and then translating that cap to the starting year. This could result in setting of the initial year cap at the level of emissions from a previous year or years. At this time, 2021 calendar year emissions have been published in the department's 2023 greenhouse gas emissions report. This data, along with additional reported data and emissions from calendar year 2022, along with 2023 RGGI emissions due at the end of this month, could be used to inform historical emissions in setting of the cap. A projection method would use the data from the historical method just described, projected to the program start date to account for newly adopted regulation, system changes, and other complementary programs that are being implemented between the historical data year or years in the first year of the program. Once we set the cap, we need to consider the cap trajectory, which will be discussed on the next slide. One of the primary purposes of this program is to work in collaboration with other programs and policies to accelerate emission reductions and the clean energy transition and help to ensure that the state achieves the statewide greenhouse gas emission limits set in the Climate Act. DEC intends to set the emission caps for 2030 and 2050 to match the statewide greenhouse gas limits for those years respectively as set forth in the Climate Act, based on the required 40% by 2030 and 85% by 2050 reductions. This translates to roughly 246 million metric ton cap for 2030 and roughly 61 million metric ton cap for 2050. To allow the program to phase in the trajectory of the cap, the trajectory of the cap will start off slowly downward and then decrease more rapidly to meet the 2030 and 2050 limits. The illustrative chart on the right-hand side of the screen shows how the maximum amount of allowable greenhouse gas emissions statewide will decline each year. The green line represents a potential budget trajectory of allowances for obligated entities. The cap is the total number of allowances. While we already know our endpoints in 2030 and 2050, that's again the 40 by 30 and 85 by 50 reduction requirements of the Climate Act, we do not know the precise starting point and downward slope and are seeking your input on the nonlinear trajectory described in the table that allows for a slower decline in the beginning of each time period with a more rapid decline as we get closer to the 2030 and 2050 limits. Once we know the cap and the trajectory, we need to determine the budgets under the cap. Next slide, please. As presented back in our June 2023 webinar series, the allowance budget will be the greenhouse gas emissions cap less the number of allowances set aside to cover non-obligated emissions under this economy-wide program. Additionally, the allowance budget may be reduced due to banking adjustments as determined during a future program review. Any banking adjustments would be reflected in future regulatory updates once the program is established and are explained in more detail in just a couple of slides. The allowance budget represents the total amount of allowances made available in a given year for obligated entities to cover their emissions requirements. We expect the majority of allowances will be auctioned by NYSERDA, while a much smaller amount of allowances would be consigned to EITE facilities. These allowances will also be made through auction by NYSERDA. The details of how EIT facilities will be consigned allowances is described in more detail later in this presentation. As noted in this formula, the allowance budget will be determined by subtracting emissions to cover non-obligated entities and any future banking adjustments, both of which are discussed in more detail in the next couple of slides. Next slide, please. Once we've determined the budget, we are creating an economy-wide since we are creating an economy-wide program, we need to account for non-obligated emissions. Next slide, please. Okay. DEC would establish the non-obligated allowances adjustments from the emissions cap based on current emissions and analysis of trends in the non-obligated and obligated sector. This would be done in the same manner as described previously in slide 24 with respect to setting of the initial emissions cap based on either a historical method or projected method. Based on this method, the adjustment for non-obligated entities would be a set value of allowances for the first compliance period. For subsequent compliance periods, the number of allowances subtracted from the cap to cover non-obligated emissions would be established by the DEC through an analysis of data from the reporting regulation and other data sources similar to those used to develop the annual inventory. Establish the initial cap in comparison to projections of emissions reduction in non-obligated sector. The number of non-obligated allowances for the next two compliance period would be published 6 months before the start of those compliance periods. This new value for non-obligated allowances would also include an adjustment for the discrepancy between past compliance period non-obligated allowances and final non-obligated emissions. The agencies are looking for comment on the process outlined and the timing of the proposed for establishing the adjustments for these non-obligated allowances. Do these methodologies described clearly establish how the department will be accounting for non-obligated emissions and provide clarity on the number of allowances available for the budget and those to be retired for non-obligated emission sources? Lastly, on the next slide, I'll touch on the concept of banking adjustments. A banking adjustment formula is not anticipated to be part of the initial program launch. However, during regular future program reviews, the agency would determine if banking adjustments support the goals of the program. A banking adjustment might be undertaken if the number of auction or otherwise held allowances could result in greenhouse gas emissions in excess of the statewide greenhouse gas limits. Provided these held allowances plus upcoming annual allowance budgets appear to result in emissions above the greenhouse gas limits, the adjustment would reduce future allowance budgets. This action would only be taken as part of future periodic program review and would be established through a future regulatory update. If this is undertaken in the future, DEC anticipates it would increase the likelihood of meeting the statewide greenhouse gas emission limit by reducing the overall supply of allowances and inducing additional emission reductions. I will now transition to the obligated sectors on the next slide. In the next couple of slides, I will discuss obligations for anticipated Part 252, the Cap and Invest regulation. Types of greenhouse gas emission sources described here refers to anticipated obligated entities under the Cap and Invest regulation, meaning entities that would have a regulatory requirement to obtain and provide DEC emission allowances in an amount sufficient to cover their emissions. DEC anticipates setting at least 3 types of thresholds for obligated entity or entities. This first type are stationary sources, such as large utilizers of fossil fuels or the other facilities which emit greenhouse gas emissions at 25,000 metric tons CO2 carbon equivalent or greater per year. These sources would have reporting requirements as identified under Part 253 and have an allowance obligations for those emissions under Part 252. Second type of obligated entities are fuel suppliers, which will have allowance obligations based on the amount of fuel sold to end users in New York. This threshold would be 100,000 gallons of liquid fuel or 15 million standard cubic feet of gaseous fuel. For purposes of determining whether a fuel supplier is an obligated entity, greenhouse gas emissions associated with the fuel sold to obligated entities, including stationary sources with emissions greater than 25,000 tons, would not be counted and will not be part of a fuel supplier's allowance obligation. This is to avoid the potential for double counting or double regulating the same ton of emissions. Finally, obligations for emissions at electricity generation are still to be determined, and the third type of potentially obligated sources will be discussed in more detail on the next slide. As noted in the pre-proposal outline and is highlighted in this slide, the sectors that would have allowance obligations currently represent about 63% of the annual emissions inventory for calendar year 2021. These sectors are represented by the green color. Another approximately 18% of emissions are in sectors where obligations are to be determined, based in part on feedback we are seeking from stakeholders. These to be determined sectors are represented here in yellow. Finally, sectors representing 19% of 2021 emissions would not have allowance obligations. These non-obligated sectors are represented here in red. It should be noted that these values are based on the latest inventory released by DEC last month and are representative of DEC and NYSERDA's current leanings as reflected in this pre-proposal. When an emission source falls below an applicability threshold, those emissions would become non-obligated, even though the sector as a whole has been identified as obligated for illustrative purposes here. it is anticipated that these changes would not have a significant impact on the overall percentages. Large stationary sources utilizing fossil fuels and residential, commercial, industrial transportation and the associated upstream out-of-state emissions related to extraction and transmission of fossil fuels make up the bulk of obligated sector emissions. Fugitive emissions shown in the table represent in-state emissions from natural gas infrastructure, including compressor stations and distribution pipelines. Upstream fugitive emissions for this sector represents emissions from thousands of oil and natural gas wells in the state and which are anticipated to be non-obligated. As noted above, allowance obligations for emissions from electricity, including in-state electricity generation that is currently subject to the RGGI program, as well as emissions associated with imported electricity, are to be determined, as are those for large users of hydrofluorocarbons, such as commercial refrigeration. Aviation emissions are anticipated to be non-obligated due to federal constraints. Agricultural emissions are anticipated to be non-obligated as these emissions come from thousands of individual farming operations. Similarly, residential septic system emissions from thousands of households are anticipated to be non-obligated. Also, emissions from residential wood combustion would be non-obligated. Lastly, as mentioned in the previous slide, the next three categories would represent the third type of sources that would be obligated under the cap and invest regulations. Solid waste emissions represent the in-state emissions associated with landfills. Exported waste sector covers waste transported to out-of-state management operations. Emissions from in-state landfills and emissions from waste exported after the implementation of the cap and invest program would have allowance obligations. Emissions for waste exported from the state before the implementation of the program would not. The non-obligated emissions from waste exported in the past are included in the red portion of the pie chart on the right side of the slide. Waste combustion emissions are anticipated to have obligations for the emissions from combustion of both biogenic and non-biogenic throughputs. Wastewater treatment facilities would have obligations for emissions from the management of organic waste. Once we have established the cap, budget, trajectory, and who needs to comply, we need to establish the compliance requirements, which I will discuss on the next slide. Next two slides will touch on the compliance process under the cap and invest rule, which will describe the manner in which obligated entities will need to comply with the allowance requirements of the program. Next slide, please. A compliance period is the time period over which an obligated emission source will be required to cover their emissions under the cap and invest program. At the end of each compliance period or interim compliance period, obligated entities must have sufficient allowances to cover their emissions. We are proposing that the first compliance period be 2 years to better align with the phased-in program stability measures under consideration, and that my NYSERDA colleagues will discuss in more detail in subsequent slides. After the initial 2-year phase-in period, each subsequent compliance period would be either 2 or 3 years as needed to align with program stability measures or the emissions limits. Accordingly, interim compliance periods would be the first year of a 2-year compliance period or the first 2 years of a 3-year compliance period. We are looking for your feedback on these leanings. Next slide. Similar to how compliance is demonstrated under the RGGI program, at the end of each interim compliance year, 50% of an obligated entity's obligated emissions would have to be covered by allowances, while the remainder of allowances for each interim compliance period plus 100% of the emissions from the last compliance year will need to be covered at the deadline for the full compliance period. Compliance deadline under consideration for both the interim and full compliance periods is June 30th. DEC would retire surrendered allowances after the deadline, and these allowances would not be available to cover any additional emissions. We are requesting comments on the timing of this deadline in concert with all elements of the program. This ends my portion of the presentation. Next slide, please. I'd like to turn it over to Vlad Gutman-Britton, Director of Policy and Analysis at NYSERDA, who will describe our plans with respect to emissions intensive and trade exposed, or EIT, industries. Vlad?
Thanks, Mike. And I'll just note that I know we got some questions come in about some of the content that we lost during our minor technical glitch there, and I think in regarding electricity reporting. So I just wanted to flag for folks that we will come back to that at the end and clarify what was missed there. Okay, so on the next slide. The CLCPA, the Climate Act, requires that in designing regulations to achieve its targets, that agencies, the DEC, the NYSERDA, and others are attentive to policy design intended to avoid leakage. The Climate Act defines leakage as a reduction in emissions of greenhouse gases within the state that is offset by an increase in emissions of greenhouse gases outside of the state. So this is an important environmental protection. If we adopt policy that reduces, for example, industrial production in New York, that may appear to be a greenhouse gas emission savings within our inventory, but if those emissions emerge somewhere else, we're not indeed driving global emission reductions. And so in order to protect the environmental integrity of the program, we want to make sure that we're providing policy and mechanisms to prevent this kind of leakage and to ensure that as much economic activity, as much industrial production is happening in places like New York that have comprehensive and ambitious climate and environmental policies on the books, like NYCI. So this schematic here at the bottom provides a little bit of a description of how we will determine and establish EITE designation, emissions intensive and trade exposed sector designation. We're going to use 6-digit NAICS codes, the North American Industry Classification System, and evaluate subsectors from the NAICS designations on the basis of whether or not these sectors meet thresholds of emissions intensity and trade exposure. So we will use publicly available data sets to calculate the emissions intensity of each subsector and the trade exposure of each subsector, and I'll describe a little bit more about how we do that in a few minutes. We will apply the thresholds that will be established by rule for both EI, emissions intensity, and trade exposure to those subsectors. And those subsectors that are both emissions intensive and trade exposed will be designated as EITE and be able to receive associated treatment. So we're certainly looking for feedback on the threshold criteria, and on the next slide, I'll describe a little bit of how we plan on evaluating this. So the first up on is the blue formula for EI, for emissions intensity. So as you see, the numerator here is the emissions associated with a given subsector within the emissions associated with a given subsector, and this is compared to that subsector's value added. So essentially, this ratio helps us understand the degree to which emissions are responsible, are coordinated, or are a substantial contributor to the value added the sector provides. As you see in this particular formula, the numerator includes both direct emissions, so scope 1 emissions, combustion on site, and things like that, as well as indirect electric emissions as well. Depending on the determination that is made on the obligation of electricity, as Mike was previously describing, that numerator may change. That is, if we are obligating electricity, we would want to preserve the indirect electric emissions in that ratio. If we choose not to obligate electricity under NYCI, then this ratio would just be changed to focus on the direct emissions as a ratio compared to the value added of that subsector. The next formula, the next blue formula there on the page, is the trade exposure formula. So this ratio is intended to compare the value of goods in a particular subsector that is crossing international borders. So the sum of imports and exports, and compare that volume to the total size of essentially the U.S. domestic market in that subsector. So the value of shipments and sales from that subsector, as well as imports for that subsector. And again, this is intended to give us a sense of the trade share for the total sector in the United States, and help us understand the degree to which this subsector is exposed to a globally competitive as opposed to a local or regional market. So in order to, as I mentioned on the previous slide, in order for an entity to receive EITE designation, its emissions intensity score and its trade exposure score would have to meet or exceed the thresholds we establish. In addition to, of course, soliciting feedback and on the specific way we formulated these ratios, we're also, of course, interested in and would desire input on at what threshold should we determine that an entity is emissions intensive or that it's trade exposed. We want to consider both of these together because this is the combination of factors from our perspective that most likely and most clearly represents the risk that this sector, the production of this sector in New York, may shift to other jurisdictions in response to the NYCI program. So for those sectors that do, for those facilities that do receive EITE treatment, the volume of the volume of no cost, we would allocate no cost allowances to them, consistent with the formula that is on the next slide. So the formula, the blue formula here in the middle, is how we will determine every year the amount of allowances that each entity that meets the definition that receives the EITE designation would receive. So the volume of allowances is a product of three components. One is the benchmark of greenhouse gas intensity of production. So we look at, based on reporting from each facility, we will establish the amount of emissions that facility requires to produce 1 unit of production, whatever it is that it may be producing. That gives us a sense of what the emissions intensity of production is that would vary, that would help us understand that as production increases, its emissions would increase in proportion and vice versa. We will multiply this benchmark by the cap adjustment factor. So the cap adjustment factor reflects the change in the overall emissions cap year over year. And the intent here is to ensure that as the NYCI program's overall cap declines consistent with the emissions requirements of the Climate Act, that the allocation, the share of allowances going to EITEs is proportionally reduced as well. And so in this way, EITEs have a clear sense that there are no-cost allowances that are providing compliance support and reduced cost that reduces leakage, but also that there is a long-term signal and direction that these facilities would need to reduce emissions consistent with the overall economy. And then finally, the last factor is O for production output. We want to make sure that we're scaling the allocation to the no-cost allocation to EITEs based on their annual output. And so in this way, if production from a given facility goes up, for example, as a result maybe of economic growth or increased demand for their product, we want to be able to facilitate, as I said, the expansion of production in New York of that subsector, because again, we want to make sure that as much production economic activity is happening in jurisdictions like New York, where there is ambitious and comprehensive climate and environmental policy on the books. Likewise, if production goes down, perhaps because of, again, changes in economics or other reasons, we want to make sure that we're scaling down the amount of allowances being allocated to that entity to, again, reflect the changing circumstances so that they're not receiving allowances for production that no longer exists, essentially. On the next slide, I want to describe how EITEs would be eligible to use these allowances. So EITE protections and mechanisms along the lines of what I've described to date are common and present in other cap and invest systems. Within NYCI, the pre-proposal just proposes a different method of treatment. So allowances allocated at no cost to EITEs cannot be used by the EITEs directly for compliance. So the EIT would not be able to take those allowances and retire them to meet its obligations under NYCI. Instead, they would be automatically consigned to auctions operated by the state. So and then the proceeds from the sale of those allowances that have now been consigned to auctions would accrue to the EITE. And so the result here is financially identical, very similar to the treatment where the allowances can be use for compliance directly, but there are benefits to this approach that I'll describe now. So to explain this maybe in a bit more detail, this means that an EITE that is participating in this program would be simultaneously a seller of allowances and a purchaser of allowances. If the amount of allowances that it's purchasing is lower than the amount allocated to it, lower than the amount that it's selling, the EIT, the net proceeds from this transaction would accrue to the EITE. If the EIT needs to purchase additional allowances, it is able to do so, and it would provide funds the necessary funds to cover that increment. So, for example, if an entity of an EITE is allocated 100,000 allowances, and as a result of early action or ambitious action to reduce emissions faster than the overall cap, it only chooses to purchase 80,000 allowances. The proceeds associated with those spare 20,000 allowances would accrue to the EITE. And so what that means is that as a result of the fact that EITE took ambitious early action to reduce its, to adopt clean energy, to adopt energy efficiency, to reduce its emissions, it receives a direct remuneration, a reward for that early action. And at the same time, other obligated entities and other market participants within the NYCI system will immediately have access to those allowances. This doesn't always happen under other approaches where EITEs may instead bank those allowances, but under this approach, the EITE receives compensation for its early action, a reward essentially for cutting emissions faster than the cap overall, and other entities have access to those allowances sooner. On the other hand, if the entity needs to purchase 105,000 allowances, and it is still in this example selling 100,000, it would need to provide the funds necessary to cover the cost of those incremental 5,000 allowances, because the first 100,000 allowances are covered by the proceeds from the consigned sale, and so we need to provide the additional funds necessary to sell the final 5,000. Purchase the final 5,000. Again, this is intended to be financially identical to the way other states carry out this program, with added benefits for all market participants, for all participants and all obligated entities in New York, while providing additional remuneration for ambitious and early action on the part of the EITE. The next slide just provides sort of a graphical representation of this process. So I'll go through it pretty quickly. DEC will establish via the formulas that I previously described the amount of allowances that each EITE is entitled to under this program. Those allowances would be automatically allocated, consigned to auction. That'd be available in the auction pool along with state-owned allowances. The EITE would determine how many allowances it needs to purchase for its own compliance obligations, and it would submit a bid for those allowances, just like any other entity participating in the auction. When the auction concludes, if that EITE seeks to purchase fewer allowances than were consigned to it, the difference, the extra proceeds, accrue to the EITE. If it needs the same amount of allowances, then it's a wash, essentially. The sale of the consigned allowances pay for the purchase of the allowances that it needs. And if it needs excess allowances, it would need to provide adequate funding to cover that incremental amount that it chose to bid. On the next slide, and actually on one more slide forward, I want to describe an additional consignment mechanism that the pre-proposal has advanced that we are eager to hear your feedback on. This one is for electric utilities, and it's for a different purpose, which is to provide a further enhancement to affordability of energy in the state of New York. So in some way, this mechanism is not dissimilar from what I previously described for EITEs, but obviously it has some marked differences. Electric utilities would be first, the DEC would establish the total allocation to this purpose, to this electric utility affordability consignment program. And then for the share of allowances dedicated to this affordability mechanism, they would be distributed to utilities on a load share basis. So just to unpack that a little bit, if in rule we establish that 10% of an allowance budget is dedicated to electric utility, this electric utility affordability program, and a given electric utility is responsible for 20% of New York's load, then that electric utility would be allocated 2% of a given allowance budget for this purpose. Those allowances, just like with EITEs, would be automatically consigned to auction, and the proceeds from the sale of those allowances would accrue to that electric utility. The purpose of these funds would be dedicated to increasing customer affordability of electricity bills. And that part would be stipulated in the rules establishing this mechanism. The exact way that that purpose is effectuated would not be stipulated in this rule, and would instead be overseen by the Public Service Commission. There's a lot of flexibility for the way this affordability mechanism can be delivered. It could be, for example, delivered as a uniform rate reduction across all the kilowatt hours that a given utility sells, or it could be more targeted via, for example, customer bill credits to a specified set of customers. There's a wide range of flexibility, and DEC and NYSERDA are, as well as our partners at the Department of Public Service and the Public Service Commission, are interested in feedback on this mechanism. We're interested in, of course, whether to include this mechanism as an additional affordability benefit on electric utility bills. If it's included, the size of electric utility consignments, so how many allowances we should dedicate to this purpose, and then how the proceeds from these consignment sales should be expended to advance affordability. Of course, the total value of this affordability benefit is a function of the allowance prices in the market, as we've identified on a few occasions. The analysis webinar tomorrow will shed some additional light on, the potential value of those allowances under different policy designs, and of course the size of the allocation to the utilities and how the money is expended. So we look forward to feedback from stakeholders across the state on that topic. So I'm going to switch gears now to on the next slide, please. And maybe one more forward on the program stability mechanisms that the pre-proposal proposes to include. So this chart on the left is hopefully a helpful visual that would show under these mechanisms that the DEC and NYSERDA are evaluating how the volume of allowances available or compliance instruments available for sale is in part a function of the price. So there are 4 principal program stability mechanisms that we are evaluating. We're evaluating these based on experience and learnings we have from the RGGI program, as well as peer states that have cap and invest programs functioning in other parts of the country. The first of these is an auction reserve price, often called a price floor. Below this auction reserve price, below this price floor, NYSERDA will not accept bids in auctions. And so that would be the minimum price that allowances may sell for in any given auction operated by NYSERDA. The next mechanism, the next step on the chart on the left, is an emissions containment reserve. 10% of allowances would be in any given in any allowance budget would be in the emissions containment reserve. In the event that the allowance price falls below a trigger price that will be specified in rule, those allowances would be withheld from auction. The intent here, as we described in the role of NYCI webinar a few days ago, is to ensure that in the event that, for example, complementary policies are substantially reducing demand for allowances, or other changes in technology or the market are reducing demand for allowances, that we don't continue to provide too many allowances, more than the market would demand, which would compromise our ability to hit CLCPA, the Climate Act's emissions targets in 2030 and 2050. So in order to prevent the circumstances where allowances are no longer needed in the same volumes, but we continue supplying them, we will instead reserve and withdraw from auctions a portion of allowances in the event that prices fall low enough to trigger that mechanism. On the flip side would be the cost containment reserve. The cost containment reserve would inject allowances into an auction if the allowances exceed, again, a trigger price that is specified in rule. The chart on the left shows visually that there could be more than one tier to the cost containment reserve. That's along with everything else, of course, something that we're soliciting feedback on. 5% of each allowance budget would be deposited into the reserve, and this would be done under the cap. So this is not an additional, these are not allowances that are additional to the cap, but are ones that become available only if necessary to help tap the brakes on cost acceleration. And finally, there would be a price ceiling mechanism. At the price ceiling, an unlimited number, subject to a set of restrictions that I'll describe in a moment, of price ceiling units would be sold and made available to obligated entities in whatever amount is needed to make those obligated entities fully compliant with the NYCI program, with the legal obligation to submit compliance instruments equal to an entity's emissions. These price ceiling units are extra. They're incremental to the cap. They're incremental to the allowance budget, and they would represent additional emissions on top of the allowance budget. And I'll discuss in a little bit how we see this program functioning on a subsequent slide. Where DEC and NYSERDA are soliciting feedback on all elements of this design, on the inclusion of these mechanisms, on setting price levels for each of these mechanisms, the size of allowances, the size of each of the reserves in those cases, whether they should be tiers, for example, for the CCR, and other feedback that that you all might identify as being useful for the agencies to hear. On the next slide, I'll spend a few extra minutes on what we call the softer price collars, which is the cost containment reserve and the emissions containment reserve. These are called soft price collars or soft cost controls because while they create an incentive for the market to stay within a range of prices, allowance prices can still fall below the emissions containment reserve trigger price or rise above the cost containment reserve trigger price. So I'll start with the cost containment reserve. So the CCR would be created and function in a way to again inject additional allowances into an auction if prices exceed a given price trigger. 5% of allowances in every allowance budget would be dedicated to the CCR and would only be sold if allowance prices, if the auction would clear above that trigger price. So if the auction is below that trigger price, those allowances would not be sold and would instead roll forward to future auctions. We are proposing to modify the sort of functionality of the CCR by changing, however, when allowances deposited into any year CCR might be available. So this mechanism would happen would cover the first 6 years of the program. What that means is that allowances deposited into the that would be deposited into the cost containment reserve in 2025 and 2026 would all be available if the trigger is hit in 2025. The net effect of this is that total aggregate emissions in 2025 and 2026 are unchanged. There's not an additional amount of total allowances being made available, but we are front loading. We're making allowances that would normally not be available until 2026 available in 2025. This is intended to provide a ramp in, sort of a glide path for the economy as it seeks to adjust to a new framework with this new NYCI policy by increasing supply, increasing the certainty, the assurity that allowances would be available in the volumes that obligated entities would need to demonstrate compliance. We would repeat this practice again for the next tranche of the program for 2027 through 2030, meaning that the allowances deposited in each of those years would be made available in the 2027 CCR. Again, total allowances being issued over that 2027 to 2030 period is not being changed, is not being increased as a result of this mechanism, but some of those allowances would be available sooner than they otherwise would be without this mechanism. Finally, with the CCR, I want to call out an additional policy mechanism, which is that in the event that allowance demand is high enough to be triggering the cost containment reserve, we would incorporate a rule that would say that general market participants, so those are entities that are participating in the market that do not themselves have a NYCI obligation, would be prohibited from submitting bids that exceed the CCR trigger. And so what that means is that in the event that the prices are escalating such that it necessitates triggering this cost containment reserve, we want to make sure that auction allowances are distributed just to those entities that need them that intend to use them for compliance and not for other purposes. So if prices trigger the CCR, the only entities that would be eligible to clear that market would be obligated entities and not general market participants. General market participants would be welcome to submit allowance bids that are below the CCR trigger and of course above the price floor, but cannot submit bids above that level. If they did, those bids would be disqualified. Okay, and on the flip side of the CCR, there's the emissions containment reserve, as previously described. The intent here would be to withdraw a tranche of allowances from auctions in the event that the price falls below the ECR, the emissions containment reserve trigger price. So again, this is intended to ensure that if the demand for allowances drops off in ways that maybe aren't anticipated at the beginning of the program, that we have an automatic adjustment that ensures that we're avoiding, let's say, an oversupply condition where there would be more allowances available in the market than would be consistent with achieving Climate Act targets. 10% of a given allowance budget would be allocated to the ECR, and those allowances would be available in all cases as long as the clearance price for the auction exceeds the ECR trigger. So on the next slide, on slide 46, to contrast to the soft price collars that I just described, we would have these hard price collars as well, a hard price ceiling and a hard price floor. So as I mentioned on a previous slide, the price floor is the level below which NYSERDA will not accept bids for allowances in auction. So there, under no circumstances would NYSERDA sell allowances below that price floor. The price ceiling works differently. The price ceiling is effectuated via the sale of price ceiling units, which I will describe in a moment. And by making these price ceiling units available, it reduces the incentive or the need for an entity to submit allowance bids that exceed this price ceiling. So the price ceiling structure would be in two phases. There would be a set price ceiling in 2025 that it would increase a little bit in 2026, and an increase in 2027 with subsequent increases in the subsequent years. And these are the two phases of the program. So in order to kind of, again, provide a glide path for the economy as it transitions into the NYCI program, we would want to sort of phase in the price levels via these two phases of the program. Again, if you tune in tomorrow, we will share an analysis about the implications of the design and setting of the price floor, of how different price floors would impact emissions outcomes and other essential metrics in the design and achievement that NYCI would provide. Of course, as we will repeat again tomorrow, we're soliciting feedback on the proper level for both the price floor and those price ceilings, and look forward to that feedback from you. So on the next slide, I will spend a little bit of time describing the functionality of the price ceiling. So the price ceiling would be effectuated via the sale of price ceiling units. So price ceiling units are similar to allowances in that they are also a compliance instrument. That is, an entity that submits a combination of allowances and price ceiling units that is equal to its emissions in a given year is fully compliant with NYCI. Where price ceiling units differ is under what circumstances they are made available and at what price they are sold. So price ceiling units would be sold at a price that is specified by rule, that is established on the front end in rule. They may not be purchased in an ongoing fashion, like allowances as part of auctions and things like that. And they would be made available only near compliance deadlines. They would be made available only to obligated entities, and in only the quantities that obligated entity needs to become fully compliant. So if it has a sum of allowances, but there's a shortfall compared to its emissions, it would be allowed to purchase price ceiling units up to the amount that it needs to be fully compliant. The price ceiling units cannot be banked, they cannot be traded, and they must be immediately retired for compliance. And so the intent, again, is to provide a temporary pressure relief valve in the event that prices are escalating. The proceeds from price ceiling units would be available for clean energy investment and things like that to, again, accelerate New York's progress toward achieving its emissions limits. The aggregate number of price ceiling units that may be sold in any given year is not limited, except that they can only be sold in volumes that are equal to the amount that obligated entities need to restore compliance. That is my last slide. I'm happy to turn it over now to Ona Papageorgiou. She is the chief of the Mobile Source and Climate Change Planning section in DEC's Division of Air Resources, and she's going to describe how the NYCI program is going to consider impacts on disadvantaged communities. Ona?
Thank you very much, Vlad. So as we've heard from John, Mike, and Vlad, this presentation focus is on the regulatory outline, and that outline was developed with specific program considerations in mind. If you could go to the next slide. Through the NYCI program, as well as parallel regulatory actions and investments, DEC and NYSERDA are prioritizing disadvantaged communities across the state. These communities have long suffered from disproportionate pollution impacts, and the NYCI program will address this. While this particular program is focused on reducing greenhouse gas emissions, we are also cognizant of co-pollutant emissions. We want to make sure that this and other regulatory programs help to reduce co-pollutant emissions in disadvantaged communities because we understand the correlation with public health impacts. In fact, the Climate Act requires that New York State decision-making, including the NYCI regulation, not result in net increases in co-pollutant emissions or otherwise disproportionately burden disadvantaged communities. Similarly, the Climate Act requires that all state agencies and authorities prioritize reductions of both greenhouse gas and co-pollutant emissions in disadvantaged communities. As the program moves on to investments, NYSERDA and other state investment agencies will dedicate at least 35% with a goal of 40% of programmatic proceeds to mitigate burdens in disadvantaged communities. Next slide, please. So as part of this commitment to reducing impacts on communities, there would be no provisions for offsets in the NYCI program. In some other cap and invest programs, offsets may be created by investing in projects that reduce or sequester greenhouse gas emissions elsewhere. In other words, not on site at the location of the source of the greenhouse gas emissions. In these other programs, greenhouse gas emission sources can comply with the cap and invest regulation by using these offsets. This can enable these sources to increase their direct on-site emissions. Some of these greenhouse gas emission sources are located in or near disadvantaged communities. So to partially address minimizing and considering emissions impacts on disadvantaged communities, there will be no offsets allowed within NYCI, as they may result in greater emissions directly on site. Next slide, please. During phase 1 of outreach, we shared that New York has considered facility-specific caps, trading prohibition between facilities within DACs and other communities, as well as requiring entities in or near disadvantaged communities to surrender allowances at some multiple of greater greenhouse gas allowances, meaning for every ton of greenhouse gas emissions that they emit, they must surrender more than one allowance. Of these three options, DEC is currently considering facility-specific emission caps for obligated entities located in or near disadvantaged communities. These limits could be placed on greenhouse gases, on co-pollutants, or both. And they would be set at a level that protects against the possibility of net increases in emissions from these facilities. With that, DEC and NYSERDA are seeking comment on this potential approach, including regarding the following components. One, the appropriateness of establishing facility-specific emission caps on obligated entities alongside NYCI. Two, whether any such caps should be placed on greenhouse gas emissions, on specified co-pollutants, or on both. Three, how this approach might interact with other requirements of NYCI. And four, the process for establishing the appropriate level of any specific emissions cap. Next slide, please. Thank you. So that being said, it's important to understand that the NYCI program won't exist in a vacuum. In fact, DEC has complementary programmatic, regulatory, and policy mechanisms also designed to address existing burdens in disadvantaged communities. Some of these are long-standing programs and regulations, such as our suite of air pollution regulations, and they have worked to improve environmental quality for years. For example, due in large part to DEC's existing suite of regulations, from the year 2000 to the year 2022, statewide emissions of pollutants from major facilities have been reduced as follows: particulate matter, 88%, sulfur dioxide, 97%, nitrogen oxides, 81%, volatile organic compounds, 67%, carbon monoxide, 58%, hazardous air pollutants, 73%. Those are the emissions. So what are our ambient levels of air quality telling us? And here are the numbers for that. From 2000 to 2022, monitored ambient levels of pollution statewide have reduced as follows. Particulate matter, which is less than 2.5 microns, so PM 2.5, 50% reduction. Sulfur dioxide, 90%. Nitrogen dioxide, 30%. Ozone, 12%. So we've made great strides, and we can be happy with that, but we all know that there is a lot more work to be done. And that is why other newer programs and regulations are under development. NYCI can also be complemented by our statewide community air monitoring initiative. This is a year-long study in the 10 disadvantaged communities with the highest air pollution burden in New York State, and it was recently completed. DEC will now be working with stakeholders across New York State to identify mitigation strategies that can reduce greenhouse gas emissions and co-pollutants in disadvantaged communities and other communities statewide. Importantly, many of the identified emission and exposure reduction strategies for disadvantaged communities will require investments. And proceeds available through the NYCI program can serve as a key source of this funding in the future once the program is established. DEC is also developing landmark environmental justice policies and regulations that can complement the investments in DACs to be made under NYCI. Late last year, DEC released a draft policy, DEP 23-1, which implements Section 7.3 of the Climate Act by providing guidance as to how and when DEC's permitting process will consider impacts on disadvantaged communities. And it also describes the analyses, procedures, and elements of review that DEC staff will apply in accordance with the requirements of Section 7.3. This year, DEC will develop regulations to implement the environmental justice siting law, which addresses the siting of certain environmental facilities with the aim of ensuring that no community bears a disproportionate pollution burden. The environmental justice siting law requires that consideration and analysis of whether an action may cause or increase a disproportionate pollution burden on a disadvantaged community in determining the outcome of certain permit decisions. Taken together, this robust suite of environmental justice action by DEC can serve to improve long-standing burdens identified through the work of the Climate Justice Working Group. Tomorrow's analysis webinar will provide additional information regarding projected health and air quality benefits of the NYCI program, including in disadvantaged communities and elsewhere. If you watch tomorrow's webinar, you'll be able to see that we are expecting to see emissions reduction and health benefits in disadvantaged communities projected as a result of the NYCI program. Now, I'd like to introduce James Wilcox, Program Manager with NYSERDA's Policy and Analysis Team, to speak about the auction program portion of this program. James?
Thank you, Ona, for sharing that very important information. As Ona mentioned, I'll be providing an overview of key components of NYSERDA's auction rule, which includes auction logistics and mechanics, as well as market integrity and the prevention of market manipulation. Next slide, please. And one more slide, please. Thank you. So similar to its role in the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, or RGGI program, under NYCI, NYSERDA will implement allowance auctions and may delegate that implementation to a qualified designee. These auctions will be held at least 4 times a year, and NYSERDA would issue a public notice containing key information 60 days prior to each auction. This will include information about auction logistics, the quantity of allowances to be auctioned, various auction parameters, and terms and conditions for participation. Next slide, please. The auction, sorry, one more slide, please. The auction bidding format will be a single round sealed bid uniform price auction. In this auction format, participants would submit bids at a specific price and number of allowances and can submit more than one bid per auction. However, bids would only be accepted if they are consistent with that entity's holding limit, auction purchase limit, and limit of financial security submitted for the particular auction. Note that these concepts will be discussed in more detail in a subsequent slide. The bids would then be sequenced or stacked in descending order, and the auction clearing price would then be determined based on the bid that exhausts all allowances made available at that auction. Then, all allowances would be sold at the clearance price to those entities that bid at the clearance price or above. To ensure adequate allowance supply for obligated entities in the event of high demand, general market participants would not be permitted to offer a bid price greater than or equal to the cost containment reserve trigger price. So when auctions exceed those price levels, only obligated entities would be able to purchase allowances. Next slide, please. So NYSERDA recognizes that the bidding process could be potentially burdensome for certain entities like smaller facilities. To address this, NYSERDA plans to include a simplified bidding option for relatively small batches of allowances. Participation would be limited. Back one slide, please. Participation would be limited to obligated entities below a certain emissions threshold, and eligible entities opting for the simplified approach would agree to purchase a specified bundle of allowances at whatever price the auction clears. Participation in simplified bidding would not preclude an eligible entity from also submitting bids in the traditional fashion. Any limitations on simplified bidding at each auction would be determined at NYSERDA's discretion and would be announced in the auction notice. Next slide, please. So across the various elements of the NYCI program, and in the auctions in particular, it's important that there are robust protections in place to ensure market integrity and to safeguard the program against market manipulation. Next slide, please. To this end, the auction rule would incorporate an explicit prohibition of collusion and market manipulation of any kind and establish clear parameters and consequences for violating this prohibition. At a minimum, the following actions would be prohibited. Except as part of certain registered associations and subject to certain restrictions, a registered entity would be prohibited from publicly releasing or disclosing to any other registered entity any bidding information. No party would be allowed to coordinate the bidding strategy of more than one auction participant unless the participants are in a disclosed association. Parties coordinating the bidding strategy for an auction participant, for example, a consulting firm, would be prohibited from participating in auctions, for example, as general market participants. Consequences of collusion could include, but are not limited to, suspension or denial of permission to participate in future auctions. Next slide, please. Another key market integrity measure that will be incorporated into NYCI are limits on the purchase and holding of allowances. These limits help ensure an open and competitive market by preventing the exercise of excessive market power, where a single entity or collection of entities have outsized influence over market prices and can manipulate prices for private gain. The auction purchase limits would be 25% of each auction's allowances for obligated entities and 4% for general market participants, while the allowance holding limits would be based on the formula you see here. These limits are broadly consistent with similar programs in other jurisdictions. Allowances submitted for compliance would no longer count towards the entity's holding limit, and the program would allow for a process for obligated entities with a large share of emissions to demonstrate that they would need to exceed the purchase or holding limit in order to comply with the allowance requirements of the Cap and Invest regulation. Next slide, please. It's important from a market integrity perspective to recognize certain associations among auction participants. These include corporate or legal associations, which is based on the required disclosure of partnerships or subsidiaries of a common parent company, and bidding associations, which allows limited coordination among participants and may help relieve administrative burden of individual entities in developing bid strategies. Auction participants in either type of association would need to disclose their affiliations to NYSERDA. The auction purchase limits and allowance holding limits discussed on the previous slide would apply at the association level collectively for participants in either type of association. In addition, auction participants in either type of association would need to disclose how the association would apportion shares of the auction purchase limit and allowance holding limit among constituent participants in a manner consistent with the rules for obligated entities and general market participants. Next slide, please. And finally, NYSERDA would retain a professional independent monitor to observe the conduct and outcome of each allowance auctions. Market monitors are commonly used to oversee commodity and energy auctions and provide objective, independent oversight of the auction process, ensure regulatory requirements are fulfilled, and examine bid prices to identify potentially manipulative behavior and other prohibited practices. So that concludes the section on the auction rule, and I'll now turn it over to Sarah Osgood, Vice President of Government and Regulatory Affairs at NYSERDA.
Thank you, James. Appreciate that. We have been receiving your questions throughout the webinar here, but before we get to those, we're going to take a short break and return in about 10 minutes for the question and answer session. Please feel free to continue to enter your questions into the Q&A feature, and we'll do our best to answer as many questions as we can when we come back. So according to my clock, I see it's 2:45. So starting the break now, we will be back at 2:55. Thank you. Great. Thanks, everyone. Welcome back. We'll now move into the question and answer period. We'll group the questions and cover those that are most frequently asked, and we'll attempt to get to as many of the questions as possible today. First up, I have several questions for Michael. So Michael, if you don't mind being prepared to answer a couple of these. So the first one is, it appears that you didn't finish your thought about what electricity importers would have to report. Could you explain what they would have to report?
Sure, thanks, Sarah. Electricity importers would be reporting entities and would be required to report their greenhouse gas emissions calculated from specified and unspecified megawatt hours at the first receiver of power in New York State. Electricity importers are required to report emissions in other jurisdictions that have economy-wide cap and invest programs. And under New York's regulation, it is anticipated that electricity importers would report similar information as identified currently in the California regulations.
Great, thank you, Mike. Next question. Under new emission reporting, what do you include under harvested wood products? Is this only wood mills? Does it include wood pellet manufacturers within or importing into New York?
Yeah, Sarah, I think that's a great question, and it highlights where we're looking for feedback from a number of different categories, and really we'd like comments on what entity would best be required to report under this requirement.
Thank you. Is the 10,000 metric tons annual threshold likely for all categories?
Not necessarily. 10,000 metric tons is the anticipated threshold for one of the three categories. For the other two, reporting may be required if the entity exists in New York or if the entity exceeds certain operational or activity thresholds.
For fuel suppliers that operate gas pipelines, would they be responsible for reporting on all gas that pass through their system, including gas not owned by the supplier and it's just being transported, or is it only for gas for which they are the seller?
Yeah, one of the primary goals in designing of the reporting program is to avoid double counting of the same ton of emissions. So we welcome input and comment on this point and how best to address it.
Can you clarify or confirm who the regulated entity, i.e. that holds the compliance obligation? Oh, sorry, I'm not losing my space. Sorry, I'm going to start over. Can you clarify or confirm who the regulated entity, i.e. that holds the compliance obligation to hold allowances, would be for the emissions associated with natural gas in buildings? Would it be the gas distribution facilities for buildings that fall below a certain threshold of usage?
It would likely be the natural gas utility that sells fuels to the building unless the stationary source or the building that they're selling to exceeds the applicable thresholds and is itself an obligated entity. In that case, such emissions would not count towards assessing the obligation for the natural gas fuel supplier.
What is the obligated entity for fugitive emissions?
Stationary greenhouse, at this time, the leaning is stationary greenhouse gas emission source infrastructure owners.
Will wastewater publicly owned treatment works greenhouse gas emissions reporting be working into SPEEDs or state pollutant discharge elimination system permits or separately?
So again, another great question, and it's an area where we would like more feedback on how to optimize and create efficiency in what we require, and if requiring it under this reg and in a SPEEDs makes it more clear, it's something we'd be looking for feedback from the community on.
What is in the product use subsector?
Product use refers to greenhouse gases that are often used in products such as refrigerators, foams, and aerosol cans. Hydrofluorocarbons, for instance, are used as alternatives to ozone-depleting substances in different product applications. Gases in this category commonly include HFCs, PFCs, SF6, and NF3, and fluorinated greenhouse gases.
What happens if an obligated entity does not cover its greenhouse gas emissions with allowances?
If an obligated entity does not cover its greenhouse gas emissions with the required amount of allowances at either the interim or final control period, it could be considered a violations of DEC's cap and invest regulation. In that situation, DEC could take enforcement action, which could include a variety of consequences from financial civil penalties up through summary abatement.
You had also shown a pie chart earlier that had obligated, TBD, and non-obligated. Does the obligated slice of 63% include industrial sources, including EITEs?
Yes, as explained by Vlad in his portion of the presentations, EITs would still have an allowance compliance obligation, but they would receive no cost allowances through consignment pursuant to the process described earlier.
If non-obligated emissions increase rather than decrease during the first compliance period, can you explain how that will affect allowances to obligated entities for compliance purposes in subsequent periods?
Sure, Sarah. I think we addressed that in slide 27. Is it possible to pull that up? I'm not. If it's up, we initially will be estimating non-obligated emissions based on current emissions and or other data to establish the budget. So that's the first process. For subsequent compliance periods, we would make an adjustment to account for any discrepancies. This means if we underestimated non-obligated emissions in that first calculation, we would make less allowances available as part of the allowance budgets in subsequent years, spread out over time over each subsequent compliance period as denoted in the formula at the bottom of the slide.
And can you describe the difference between out-of-state electricity and out-of-state fossil fuels - electricity?
Sure. Out-of-state electricity in that chart is meant to cover electricity that is imported into the state, while out-of-state fossil fuels electricity is accounting for the upstream emissions from the fuels combusted at an electric generating source.
Okay. And the final one I have for you right now, Mike, can you please explain how exported waste will be considered? Does new only mean that existing volumes that are exported will continue to be non-obligated?
Yeah, the current leading is that new exporters of waste would be obligated under the program, while current or historical exportations would be non-obligated. That said, we're taking comment on all aspects of the program, including the split we're mentioning here.
Great, thank you, Mike.
Mm-hmm.
That's it for right now for you.
You.
Now we've got several questions teed up. Jonathan Binder, if I could ask you to be prepared to answer a couple of these. The first one is, the outline mentions plans for regular program reviews. Do you have a sense for how often these program reviews would take place? Would that be written into the regulation?
So at a minimum, we would expect periodic program reviews of the regulations to happen on a 3 or 5 year basis after we adopt the regulations. That's something that is already required under the provisions of the State Administrative Procedure Act, or SAPA. We do welcome your input on how frequent those program reviews should be. I do want to note that we have done periodic and comprehensive program reviews for the RGGI program. In fact, we're right now in the midst of the third one of these periodic program reviews. And so that general process is something that we are looking to replicate for NYCI.
Understood. Will biofuels such as biodiesel and renewable diesel be obligated fuels or exempt fuels?
Thanks for the question. We would expect these to be obligated, and that's consistent with how we do Climate Act greenhouse gas accounting, including gross accounting for greenhouse gas emissions. As I think we've said on several occasions, we are intending to utilize the Climate Act emissions accounting for purposes of the NYCI program.
Can you clarify whether non-RGGI electric generating units would be obligated sources regardless of a determination on the electric sector coverage and approach to RGGI covered electric generation units? The California program looks through the central stationary greenhouse gas emission sources, the central plant, to the individual consumers. Only those individual consumers that exceed the 25,000 metric tons would be considered obligated. Is the New York plan going to have the same exemption? Geez, sorry.
It's a mouthful. So, I mean, generally speaking, with the electricity sector, this is something that we are very much taking comment on. We have not made a determination regarding whether or not electricity sources are going to be obligated. And that is inclusive of both RGGI covered electric generating sources and other sources that are in the electricity sector.
So we've also been using a number of acronyms and terms of art throughout this presentation. Do we have a glossary of all of those that are used in the NYCI program? It looks like there might be a little bit confusion, for example, over the term leakage, which some folks are suggesting, you know, can that usage would connotate oil spills or methane escape.
Right. Yeah, thanks for the question. The pre-proposal outline itself does have some select definitions in it. So there's that, but then with respect to leakage in particular, that is a term that is actually defined in the Climate Act itself. And that definition is really about a reduction in emissions of greenhouse gases within the state, within New York, that is offset by an increase in emissions of greenhouse gases outside of the state. So that's what we're referring to when we talk about leakage in the context of this program and the Climate Act in general.
Great.
Not spills. Mm-hmm.
Could you clarify, one, why NYSERDA and DEC are not considering a prohibition on obligated entities located in or near DACs from purchasing or trading allowances outside of DACs? And two, how will this decision ensure that DACs are not disproportionately burdened by program implementation?
Well, I think, first of all, generally speaking, both DEC and NYSERDA do not expect trading within this program to hurt or to adversely affect equity outcomes, and that's something that we will be addressing further in the analysis presentation tomorrow. But also, as Ona described, we also have a variety of other investment and regulatory mechanisms that we expect will help to ensure that disadvantaged communities benefit. So we are thinking about a variety of those approaches that we talked about, but we are focused on facility-specific emission caps for obligated entities that are located in or near disadvantaged communities. We think that this is the best means of protecting against the potential for those net increases in emissions. Again, we don't expect those net increases in emissions or disproportionate impacts on disadvantaged communities to occur, but we think that facility-specific emission caps are the best potential mechanism to protect against that possibility. That being said, we are still taking comment on all of these things, including about the specifics of the facility-specific emission caps approach. And I think Ona mentioned some of these points earlier. That includes, and this is a good idea, whether it is appropriate to establish these caps on obligated entities alongside of the NYCI program. And then if we do adopt those, whether they should be on greenhouse gas emissions or on specified coal pollutants or both, and just kind of generally how that is going to interact with the NYCI program in general. But I think it is important to keep in mind again, as I think we talked about a little bit earlier in the week on Tuesday when we had the overview role of NYCI webinar, we did provide some perspective then about the general role of trading within a program like this. And as we talked about on Tuesday, we do think that trading is an important mechanism because it helps to provide program stability, helps to lower prices overall, and supports early action for reducing emissions and addressing clean energy. So again, we welcome your input on this point, and we also encourage folks to join the webinar tomorrow, which again will include discussion about the expected air quality and health benefits in disadvantaged communities projected from this program.
Thanks, John. What are the implications on the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative? Will New York's participation in that continue or not?
Yeah, good question. Thanks for asking it. New York State does remain committed to our participation in their Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, or RGGI program. This is a very successful program that has reduced emissions and shown, I think, the successes of a cap and invest program for the power sector. We are currently engaged in discussions with our RGGI participating state colleagues right now as part of that third periodic program review that I mentioned earlier. And as part of that discussion with our other states, we are seeking to align the RGGI program with the requirements of the Climate Act. That includes zero emissions by 2040 power sector. I think as we've been emphasizing with respect to the NYCI program, we have not yet made a determination regarding whether those RGGI sources would be obligated under the NYCI program, and we do welcome input on this point.
What is the social cost of carbon that has been assumed for NYCI? DEC had previously provided a range of value.
Yeah, so I might be referring to what we have established under the Climate Act, which is called the Value of Carbon Guidance. This is a document that we adopted several years ago under the Climate Act, which is a tool that can be used by state agencies and authorities and other entities to aid in our decision-making. So in some decision-making contexts, particularly those like NYCI that value carbon, there might be some alternative approaches that are more appropriate for resource valuation and benefit cost analyses.
Okay, just a couple more for you, John.
Sure.
Second to last one, would the EJ siting law only apply to new facilities and facilities seeking updated permits and not all existing facilities on day one?
So that recently passed siting law that Ona mentioned, it applies to all major permit applications. So that includes for new projects as well as permit renewals and modifications. And that's something that DEC is beginning the process now of adopting and developing the regulations to implement that law.
And final one for you at this point, has consideration been given to formally linking the NYCI program with those of other states such as California or Quebec?
Yes, it's definitely something that we are considering. And is absolutely one of the principles that Governor Hochul laid out for us and that we've been repeating at each of these webinars. One of those is specifically climate leadership, which is really about making sure that we design this program with the ability to link the NYCI program with other programs and other markets that are already established in other jurisdictions. So we're going to continue to explore those links and those possible links and welcome discussions with our other jurisdictions along those lines.
Great, thank you, John. Next up, we have several questions for Ona Papageorgiou. So Ona, if you could be prepared to answer a couple here. So first one I have is, can you please define or give examples of co-pollutant emissions as were outlined in our discussion of DAC protections?
Sure. Co-pollutants include hazardous air pollutants or other air pollutants aside from greenhouse gases that are also emitted by sources that emit greenhouse gases. So some examples of co-pollutants can include fine particulate matter. We also call that PM2.5, sulfur dioxide, nitrogen oxide emissions, and those types of emissions that come out with a source that generates greenhouse gases. And while this program, I think I mentioned this before, but I think it's important to reiterate, while the program is focused on reducing greenhouse gas emissions, we're also seeking to reduce co-pollutant emissions in disadvantaged communities and throughout the state.
Thanks, Ona. Another question specific to slide 52. Is there a place where the co-pollutant emissions reductions that were mentioned by you on that slide are reported and can be viewed?
Well, the emission reductions on slide 52 are DEC's evaluation of reported Title V facility emissions since 2000. Title V is a Clean Air Act program where we collect data from larger sources in New York State. Information on reported emissions since 2010 is available on Open Data New York. It's a website where we upload large pieces of data. And the reductions in monitored air quality are averages of ambient contaminant concentrations from DEC's ambient monitoring system since 2000, and annual reports of DEC's monitoring results are available on the DEC webpage.
Great, thank you very much, Ona. That's all we have for you at this point in time. Next up, Vlad Gutman-Britton, if you could be prepared to answer a couple questions. First one relates to slide 13. If perhaps we could have the Cadmus team pull that up. Slide 13 indicates that landfills and wastewater treatment plants are subject to the program. We have a specific question wondering about a specific town and whether we have estimates of the costs that any specific water treatment plant would incur annually under the new program.
Sure, thanks, Sarah. So on tomorrow's webinar, where we will be showing our preliminary analysis that includes cost estimates and potential allowance prices. That webinar will provide the information we have available around costs and those inputs. So while we're not at this time, while we don't currently have available an estimate on any one specific entity or any one entity's likely cost, anybody who tracks that webinar would be able to use their own knowledge of their facility's emissions and develop an estimate based on that.
Great, thanks. Next question, what is the rationale for the slower reduction in greenhouse gas emissions from 2031 to 2040? It makes sense for the initial window as we get started, but once we hit 2030, it's not clear why a second slow reduction window would be needed.
Sure. Well, so broadly speaking, the nonlinear cap is intended to provide time for markets and supply chains to adjust to the emissions transition, to ensure that investments made available thanks to NYCI have sufficient time to drive emission reductions at sufficient speed. We anticipate that we know that the emission reductions required between the 2030 and 2050 period are also ambitious. And so the pre-proposal suggests this additional ramp-in be extended for that second 20-year period to support affordability, implementability benefits. But of course, we welcome feedback on this approach and where it is appropriate to implement and not.
Great, thank you. We have a number of questions regarding energy intensive and trade exposed industries. The first one is, why was energy intensity disregarded?
We don't disregard energy intensity, but we do think that emissions intensity is the most appropriate proxy for the potential costs and impacts of NYCI and its potential influence on leakage. One particular important consideration is that were we to focus exclusively on energy intensity, for example, that would neglect large sources of direct emissions from industrial processes. For example, limestone calcination in the cement sector wouldn't be included if we were principally or exclusively focused on energy intensity. So we wanted to really understand the how NYCI impacts the cost structure potentially of industrial subsectors and really make sure that we're reflecting that impact to their particular functionality. So in our view, the method that we're advancing considers, of course, the impact of energy, since there is, especially in many of these facilities, a direct correlation between volume of energy use and energy intensity and the emissions intensity of that facility, while also having a broader look at other impacts that certain facilities may experience.
Will EI and TE facilities be calculated based on metrics for New York facilities only or facilities nationwide in each industrial sector?
The pre-proposal methodology would calculate both of those metrics based on facilities nationwide in each industrial subsector, but we welcome feedback on this approach.
Will trade exposure consider the ability of an industry to simply relocate to another state?
The methodology in the pre-proposal for determining trade exposure is similar to those of other cap and invest systems globally. The considered methodology compares total trade of a sector with the size of the domestic market to understand trade exposure. So it really is evaluating the degree to which any one entity or subsector is kind of transacting on a footprint that is larger than purely on a local basis. The more heavily traded a good is relative to the domestic market, the less likely an entity is able to pass on costs of emission allowances in its products without hurting its market share, and so that for us is in fact a proxy of the ability to leak to other jurisdictions, to shift production and things like that.
Are the EITE applicability calculations also used by the federal government? And do we expect the federal and New York State EITE designations to cover similar industries or entities?
There is not a current federal designation for EIT industries. EIT calculations have been contemplated in federal legislation, but not enacted.
Okay. Next question. If the 2030 and 2050 greenhouse gas limits are legally binding, how does that impact provisions like the cost containment reserve that would add more allowances to circulation and effectively increasing the cap in a given year? Could the cost containment reserve be triggered in 2030, even if that increases the cap above what the Climate Act says the total greenhouse gas limit has to be in that year?
CCR allowances, cost containment reserve allowances, are sourced from below the cap. And so they are designed to reconcile well with the overall emissions cap and the trajectory. Because the CCR is part of the cap, that reserve is part of how we build up to the cap. Triggering the CCR does not pose a risk to exceeding the allowance budget.
Will the auction revenues that go back to the state to be administered by whomever it is, whether it's NYSERDA or other entities, would they be obligated to pay towards the state's cost recovery fee?
Proceeds that the state generates from NYCI auctions and allowance sales will be placed in the Climate Action Fund that is established by law in the budget that passed last year, and it will be administered in accordance with such law.
Is there sufficient evidence to ensure that EITEs will not attempt to exercise market power by bidding up the price of allowances that they are then allotted?
NYSERDA anticipates incorporating a variety of measures in the auction rule that are intended to set acceptable competitive and market practices and ensure transparency on the part of all market participants. James touched on, during his presentation, on a series of these types of restrictions and regulations that are intended to ensure that no single entity or group of entities are able to exercise excessive power. So these provisions include prohibitions on collusion and other practices that would allow EITs or anybody else to be able to exercise undue influence on outcomes of allowance auctions or any other market functionality under NYCI.
How do you plan to address leakage to other states rather than internationally? It appears that the pre-proposal is not going to protect industries subject to interstate competition from competitors in states without carbon pricing.
So the pre-proposal envisions addressing the risk of leakage by providing entities that are determined to be EITE with a share of no cost allowances. So this will provide protection against leakage that may occur due to all forms of out-of-state production, whether that out-of-state production is happening in a neighboring state or another part of this country or abroad. Other state and regional carbon regulation schemes, notably in California and in certain Canadian provinces, have used a similar approach in the face of the same type of interregional trade pressures.
Great. This one, I apologize if it seems a little complicated here, but this is about one of the formulas that you showed on one of the slides that you presented, where it said A equals B times CA times O. Is the B factor in the EIT allocation formula, is that facility or sector specific?
So maybe as a reminder for those that haven't committed by now all of the formulas to memory, this formula reflects the amount of allowances that any given EITE is entitled to be allocated at no cost. The B factor refers to an emissions intensity benchmark of production. So the volume of greenhouse gases associated with producing 1 unit of whatever it is that facility produces. So NYSERDA and DEC are considering a methodology that is likely to determine benchmarks at a facility level based on information reported by those facilities. However, we remain open to input on the most appropriate ways of setting benchmarks for this no-cost EITE allocation. In particular, if stakeholders do recommend setting the benchmark based on a sectoral level, which is embedded in the question, We would be grateful for feedback on data acquisition and making sure we have sufficient information to allow the setting of such benchmarks at a sufficient level of granularity.
Is it envisioned that the price of allowances will be established as bid or on a clearing price basis?
So auctions would settle on a clearing price basis. So the bid that bids would be organized in a bid stack and descending by descending bid amount by the size of the bid. Highest bids first, the next highest bid next, and on down the line. Auctions would then settle, as I said, on a clearance price basis. So the bid that exhausts the available supply of allowances would be the price that all participants who bid above that level would pay.
Do other cap and invest systems have similar minimum hold times or allowance purchases? And would that apply just for spot purchases, or would that have any impact on the allowance futures market?
Different versions of hold times do exist in other cap and invest systems. NYSERDA would not plan to regulate the specific conduct of transactions on the secondary market, but allowances that are purchased there would need to be held for a specified period of time before being resold.
Has NYSERDA modeled the projected impact on natural gas and fuel oil prices in New York?
Yeah, the analysis webinar tomorrow that starts at 11 a.m. Will share information on the cost impacts of NYCI. Well, welcome your participation in that webinar.
When will you provide the details behind the obligations for the electricity generation sector?
So also at tomorrow's webinar, we will summarize detailed modeling of the implications of obligating the electricity sector under NYCI in terms of things like installed capacity, energy balance, emissions reduction, and emissions leakage, as well as the incremental cost of the electricity system. So we welcome feedback following that presentation on the appropriate choice for this topic.
The pre-proposal outline states that an entity that is not obligated for whatever reason may still be subject to charges through their fuel supplier. Is there any guidance on how that would occur? And there's multiple parts of this question. Will the same clearing price of the auctions be assessed on the amount of fuel purchased, or is there a different metric? Will the fuel supplier be required to participate in the auctions and pass those costs on to the consumer? Will this occur at the utility level or the ESCO level?
The degree of allowance price pass-through by entities to eventual end-use consumers of fuels is not something that would be regulated or determined by the NYCI rules. There is certainly not going to be a requirement to pass on the costs.
Would there be a mechanism in place to prevent an obligated entity that is banned from auctions due to collusion or market manipulation to trade with other obligated entities at a later date?
NYSERDA does not plan to regulate entities' participation in the secondary market. The rules that we described on holding limits and things like that would, however, apply at all times to all entities.
How many years of greenhouse gas data will be used to determine the benchmark in the allowances calculation?
NYSERDA and DEC have not yet determined the number of years of data that would be used to determine the benchmark, and we welcome we welcome input on the optimal approach.
Thanks, Vlad. Last question for you for right now, related to auctions. Can a general market participant bid on behalf? Oh, sorry. Losing my spot here. Can a general market participant bid on behalf of an obligated entity if properly disclosed in a bidding association? And if so, would the general market participant be able to submit bids at prices above the cost containment reserve trigger price and for volumes up to 25% of the initial offering?
Auction participants in bidding associations would need to disclose how the association would apportion shares of auction purchase limits among constituent participants in a manner that is consistent with the rules for obligated entities and general market participants. This would not be a mechanism, though, by which a general market participant would be able to submit bids in excess of the limits that are otherwise imposed on them.
Great. Thank you very much, Vlad. That's all the questions we have for you at this particular point in time. Michael, if I could ask you to rejoin us, we've got several more questions for you. Will all greenhouse gas emission sources be required to comply with third-party verification rules, or only, quote unquote, the most significant greenhouse gas emission sources? If only the most significant sources must comply, why? And can we also clarify what emissions are considered the most significant?
Yeah, thanks, Aaron. And thanks to all our stakeholders for providing these great questions. Third-party verification is anticipated to be required for the most significant sources of greenhouse gas emissions, which we would expect to include any source that is obligated, or if they're a reporting entity only, their emissions exceed 25,000 tons of CO2e. This was discussed in slide 20 for reference, should the stakeholder want to go back and review that.
Would local gas distribution companies, for example, Con Ed or National Fuel Gas, be considered obligated entities under this program?
Well, we have not yet fully established which entities would meet the specific definitions that we are proposing here for obligated entities that have been shared in the presentation. It is likely that local gas distribution companies or utilities would meet that definition.
Great, thank you, Mike. I think we've got a few more questions. Just give me a second here to pull them up. Jonathan Binder, it looks like we have one more for you. To what extent does the 2030 and subsequent emissions cap account for existing and adopted regulations and programs? For example, Champlain, the Chippy, or offshore wind, etc.
So the emission caps themselves, the emission caps that are set for 2030 and 2050, those were established by law under the Climate Act. That's the 40% by 2030 and the 85% by 2050 requirement. That's also in DEC regulation, where we translated those to the millions of metric tons that we discussed earlier. What we're taking comment on is what the trajectory of the cap will be between the beginning of the program and 2030, and then again between 2030 and 2050. But what those caps are already set in law under the Climate Act, and that's what we're working towards.
Great, thank you, John. And with that, that completes the questions that we're able to answer at this point in time. So if we could go back to the slide deck, I'd like to turn it over to Joe Berman, Senior Advisor for Strategic Partnerships at NYSERDA, to close us out with the next steps.
All right, excellent. Hi, Sarah, can you hear me?
I can hear you fine.
Excellent. So thanks so much, Sarah. I really appreciate it. And good afternoon, everyone. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Joe Berman, and I am the Senior Advisor of Strategic Partnerships for NYSERDA. This brings us to the end of what we wanted to present here today. And on behalf of the NYCI team, I'd like to thank you again for attending today's webinar. This was the second webinar in the series for the second stage of pre-proposal stakeholder engagement. This event is added to the series of 9 webinars and events that were conducted under the first stage of outreach since June of 2023 to outline potential elements of New York's Cap and Invest program and identify specific areas where stakeholder feedback would be especially valuable. As we shared and multiple times over the course of this event, we have one more webinar coming up tomorrow as a continuation of this series. This webinar is a preliminary analysis overview, and that'll be taking place tomorrow morning, January 26th, from 11 to 2 p.m. or 11 a.m. Pardon me, to 2 p.m. If attending the preliminary analysis overview is of interest to you, we welcome you to sign up at the capitandinvest.ny.gov/meetings and events registration link provided on the slide. The registration link is live as of now, so please feel free to sign up at your convenience. If you're looking for the pre-proposal outline and the affordability study, you'll also be able to find that on the capitandinvest.ny.gov website. To access the recording of today's webinar, it's going to be made available on the Cap and Invest website in the very near future. So please go to the website over the next couple of days if you're looking for those resources. As a reminder, details for future webinars and recordings of past webinars can also be found on the meetings and events page of the Cap and Invest website. As we proceed in the coming days through what remains of the NYCI program design pre-proposal comment process, to ensure that your voice is heard, we strongly encourage you to provide feedback to inform the regulations development. We are accepting comments on the NYCI program at any time, but would really appreciate it if you would provide your pre-proposal comments by March 1st, 2024, so that the team can evaluate your feedback as they develop the regulatory proposal. Final regulations will be released following the formal public comment period. If you could move the slide. All right. So now to ensure that you know how to share your feedback on the NYCI program, with the NYCI program team, I want to just take a minute to walk you through the process of submitting public comment through the Cap and Invest website. Here are screenshots of the Cap and Invest website. And to submit comments for consideration by NYSERDA and DEC, please click on the Cap and Invest rule button at the top of the page. There you'll find information on the Cap and Invest rulemaking process, and about halfway down the page, you'll find this the Submit Comments button. Also on this page is a PDF commenting form that you can download. This form has editable fields organized by the major topic headings for which we're seeking feedback. You may use this form to help organize your comments and submit the form as an attachment. Please note that the Submit Comments button and the PDF commenting form are available on every page of the Cap and Invest website. So if you're looking for those items, they should be really easy to find. The Submit Comments button will direct you to the comment management platform where you can directly enter comments or upload attachments that contain your comments. Ooh, we got a little bit of mood lighting here, practicing energy efficiency at NYSERDA corporate headquarters. So if you could move the slide, please. All right, to ensure that you receive updates about future NYCI events and activities as the program development process proceeds, we'd like to recommend that you sign up to the Cap and Invest mailing list, which has been mentioned over the course of this event on many occasions rather. And you can do this by visiting capandinvest.ny.gov. As a reminder, details for future webinars and recordings of past webinars can also be found on the meetings and events page of the Cap and Invest website. You can also submit written feedback to the mailing address seen on the screen, and you can send that feedback to Bureau of Air Quality Planning, New York State DEC, Division of Air Resources, 625 Broadway, Albany, New York, 12233. As a final reminder, we are accepting comments on the NYCI program at any time, but again, would appreciate it if you would provide your pre-proposal comments by March 1st, 2024, so that the team can evaluate your feedback as they develop the regulatory proposal. Before we go, I would like to thank you again for making the time to join the webinar today. We hope that the content provided has been informative and look forward to seeing you again tomorrow for the preliminary analysis overview. This concludes today's webinar, and have a great day.